Coordinates computer. Okay. All right, and you're still seeing my screen, right? Yeah. Okay, so what I want to say is this is the first of 4 workshops. The second one will be 2 weeks, September 30th, and it'll be, you know, kind of in a similar vein, but talking more specifically about different techniques of representation. And we'll have a guest who's really, really kind of an expert experimenter and really awesome, you know, just generally in terms of the theoretical ideas around it and also practice. Leah Wolfman, she's currently teaching at SciArc as a graduate from there. And then in a month from now, on October 14th, we'll have a workshop about hybrid activism, or sort of like what does, you know, how does activism, how does political engagement look in these disconnected times, in these times of blended learning. And we'll have Lexi Tien, which probably a lot of you know. She's teaching at GSAPP, and she's teaching ADR1, which is you know, something I've also been teaching for a few years before, prior to this. So that should be a really interesting one. And then the final one, you know, given that a lot of you are, some of you are probably graduating, the idea is that we'll talk about hybrid practice. So, you know, once you enter the world of, let's say, of work or business or outside of school, you know, you're going to encounter a very different environment than what we, than maybe what you expected going into school. And that's something to discuss, but I personally think that this moment in crisis is not just something that will go back to normal, but that things will definitely change permanently and influence how architecture is practiced in some ways. And so even just through living through this experience. Yeah, that last conversation is sort of talking about how this moment, sort of hybrid moment we're experiencing now, this blended learning, is going to affect architecture practice. So, you know, kind of talking also about my own experience and talking about how send you off sort of with hopefully some ideas of how you can go into the world after this. So this is just to give you an overview of the overall thing. So now I want to start this lecture about, you know, let's say web VR and virtual connection actually through a very physical phenomenon, kind of asking, you know, you know, how can we replicate the water cooler effect? You guys know what the water cooler effect is? Anybody has heard this before? It's pretty common. Everyone's okay. This is like too much pressure. I'll have you up on the second screen, but anyway, the water cooler effect, just in case, is this idea that, you know, when people have sort of meeting points where they are in a way forced to encounter each other because they have to, like, something very functional, like getting water, coffee, they'll exchange gossip and information in these points. And so this is a Harvard study where they were basically analyzing, so that the height of the building indicates the number of citations that a publication got, and then the color indicates how close or how many water coolers were actually placed in this building. So there was actually a correlation that was found between sort of these kind of places of encounters. Oh, sorry, it wasn't just water coolers. Basically, if the two scientists actually worked in the same building and not in like a totally different location. So basically, this seems to prove, and this was, you know, done when there was already, internet was already a thing. So, but still this idea that basically the people who were working together, if they were physically very close, there were more citations on this paper. So they were basically better papers. And another physical phenomenon is the Allen curve, which was studied in the 70s. And that basically says that the closer you are to somebody, the more face-to-face communication you will have, which is makes sense, right? Like you probably talk more to a person who like happens to sit very close to you than somebody who's really far away. So in this sense, but I think what's interesting about the curve is how extreme the change is. So, you know, when you're very, very close to somebody, you'll be talking to them all the time, essentially. And even at 8 meters, which is like, you know, 20 feet away, basically this curve drops off really drastically. And, you know, once you get to like 60 meters or 24 meters, basically there's almost no communication anymore. Like it's below the 5% line. So physical proximity at least in 1977, had an extreme impact on how much people would communicate. So in that sense, you know, my question today and to you is sort of how does virtual technology impact the Allen curve? Of course, now, you know, we're talking to people, and not just now, but since decades now at this point, we're talking to people all the time, every day, that are infinitely, not infinitely, but very far away, or, you know, it doesn't really matter how far away they are. So in that sense, the Allen curve, still holds, right? When you're in a physical space, you'll still be talking to the people who are closer to you. So you might actually be talking to somebody who's physically close to you a lot more, and somebody who's at a random distance because they're connected to you through the internet, but somebody who's in the same space. Right now I'm in an office space that, you know, people on the other side that are 60 meters away from me, I don't talk to them at all, even though they're much easier, even though they're kind of physically in the same space as somebody who would be on another continent. So this is just an important framework for this conversation. And finally, the third concept is propinquity, which is this idea of, you know, the more often you run into somebody, the more likely you are to marry them, or to, you know, be friends with them, or to have to like them. And so again, a very simple concept, very intuitive, but it has huge impact on how societies work, you know, in terms of how you design cities, how you design intersections, how do you design again, this sort of accidental places of encounter. Because as simple as running into somebody every day increases your risk, not your risk, but your the likelihood of liking them, you know, by a really, really high percentage. So propinquity, it's a fancy word. You can also just throw it out. But really, oh yeah, I want to increase the propinquity in that design. So again, these three physical concepts, you know, I guess as a starting point that have proven to be so useful, kind of can act as a framework for us to think about how we can recreate or think those in VR. But before we get into VR right away, there's obviously a lot of communication tools online, right? Here's just some kind of a personal section of things that I use or that I'm really familiar on an everyday level. But you know, there's an even much larger ecosystem. But today we'll talk about 3D tools specifically because you know, well, we're architects, and I think it has a particular fascination to how we're working, and also because 3D tools actually bring back some of these phenomena that, you know, that I've just talked about. They can bring in this idea of distance and space. So in three-dimensional environments, we can actually perhaps recreate some of these physical phenomena that I just mentioned, because they're entirely removed from something like WhatsApp, right? It really doesn't matter how close you are physically to somebody. So I'll browse over this. It's mostly just, you know, kind of super brief history of VR. So essentially in 1838, this guy Wheatstone kind of invented the stereoscope, and that was essentially just the idea that if you look at two images at an angle, your eyes start to project a three-dimensional image between these two planes. And it's actually a concept that's related to, I mean, some of you might know that I'm really obsessed with photogrammetry, and with photogrammetry it's the same idea that if you have two planes, you know, and you put them at an angle, you essentially start creating a three-dimensional image. And this is really the foundation of VR up to today. You know, when you, in the end, everything you create from the computer comes from a flat image that is just projected at a certain angle. And you know, fast forward more than 100 years later, so Morten Heilig is kind of considered the father of photogrammetry. And again, those are just very beautiful images. You know, sort of this is a patent of something he called the sensorama, and the idea was that it would be like a fully immersive theater, so something where you would basically have, you know, a 3D movie. And he really believed in that would be the future of movies, and that's how everyone's going to make movies very soon. And obviously that didn't happen. But you know, in terms of VR, it was definitely a very visionary concept. And he even had smell integration. He had sort of I think this chair, as you see, was kind of moving, so you really had like a full immersive experience when you were watching these. But I think there were only 6 movies actually made for that device. And here's so this same guy, Morten Heilig, created these patents here, and you know, this looks very much like a VR headset as we know it today, and he calls it the telesphere mask. And It didn't really do that much. Like it wasn't tracking you. It didn't know where you are in space. So it wouldn't move with your head, but it did have a three-dimensional effect when you were looking through. And then even Sutherland, which some of you might know from Sketchfab. I love talking about him every year in ADR, but he's essentially kind of like the person who really invented graphical user interfaces. He also experimented with VR and built this slightly dangerous looking device, and he also called it the Sword of Damocles, some kind of engineering joke, I guess. But again, advancing this idea of VR from a technical perspective. And at the same time, the military already started using VR in training and actually in military applications, which actually to this day is being very heavily used by the military for on one hand training purposes, but actually also in combat. And in this was, I think, early 70s. Walter Pichler is an Austrian architect who created these kind of prototypes. They were actually working. They were more conceptual pieces, but they projected, I guess, an architectural kind of projected this idea of an architecture that can be worn, that is like the smallest possible space, and that can also then be literally inhabited and kind of transported to different worlds. And so these prototypes are kind of humorous almost, but they maybe wouldn't be included in a regular history of VR, but obviously in architecture school, I think they're relevant. And then in the late 80s, 90s, there were the first actual sort of, beyond sort of enthusiasts and researchers and nerds and people who and architects, there were the first companies who were trying to make money with this. So VPL Research was kind of like the first company that really tried to develop headsets and also these gloves. But obviously that wasn't ready yet for the big consumer market, but they actually did produce a lot of really interesting products. And it was used in by Crystal River Engineering for to train astronauts. So that was also an early application, and here you see the image. It's always hard to know from these images how well those things work. I mean, they look really cool, but they probably were like really grainy and black and white. But maybe that would be another kind of research or exhibition to actually figure out to replicate the experiences within these. And then in the 90s, the virtuality group actually started producing larger quantities and made these devices for arcades. So arcades actually had VR, kind of routinely in the 90s already, and I guess they were the early adopters at the time for people playing games. Here nicely advertised. I really like this image of this lady in water. So 2012 was the year that Kickstarter started developing, but they had started like not very much earlier. So basically, 1 or 2 years prior, this 16-year-old guy essentially started developing Oculus and really revolutionized the market through that. And he started off, essentially just hacking together headsets, but really quickly gained traction. And this was a Kickstarter that he started. And you can see here that the goal was $250,000, and he got 10 times more. He got like $2.5 million because people were so convinced of his technology, and he got all these backers. And anyway, Oculus, from being this like tiny independent company that barely made like that money was sold to billions to Facebook only a couple of years later, and is now kind of the flagship product of Facebook. And what's interesting about that particular today was actually so Facebook launched the Oculus Quest 2, which is a new headset, which really, Mark Zuckerberg was streaming live on the internet on YouTube, and he was basically just totally is a 100% believer in VR and thinks it's going to change everything. And I guess we have that in common in some way, but he really wants Facebook to kind of control the whole thing. And so we can get into that debate, but here's, you know, another, in that super quick history, we can see how it went from sort of like a very niche thing to at the moment being something that's about really, and this time I think really, because it's definitely the technology that always seemed like 2 years away, right? Like people in 2016, people got really excited when the first Oculus Quest came out. They're like, okay, it's here, the hype, you know, and we'll see. I mean, maybe not this year, but definitely in the next few years, I think it's going to arrive on a much bigger market. In any case, so here's some really funny images, or you know, images of the Oculus Quest sort of patents. Also, you know, if you look at them closely, kind of revealing a little bit this ideas of a lot of ideas about how that would be used. So clearly, these people at home, and then they're dreaming of the beach, and they're very, you know, you can sort of analyze what kind of people they are, and sort of like projecting a very specific kind of person to be using this. Also here, you know, we have this guy. It's always a guy kind of looking at this choices. Who would you like to reach? You may say mom or Jane. So you can like choose between these two images and decide who he wants to reach with, you know, through his goggles, just through kind of like some kind of avatar of this other person. And again, here a very sort of conventional domestic interior or exterior in that case, with like the dog and the little house. So yeah, here just some context for how this was imagined to be used and so on. So VR in architecture today is actually already being used somehow, and you know, it seems to be mostly by white men for some reason. Like on all the images, it's always just that kind of population using it. I mean, which is definitely not the case, but it's the marketing images for some reason. But it's actually used very much in sort of BIM engineering purposes. So there's apps that are exporting models from Revit to VR, and here you can also, there's a link. You know, there's this is a project by Big and UN Studio to kind of help not just to visualize projects in VR, but also use them for kind of quick prototyping and changes. But it's still in development. So this one's actually, you know, again, it's one of these technologies that's about to happen. But isn't quite happening yet. So and this definitely fall into this category. But some apps are out there and working, just maybe not super widely adopted, I would say. I mean, there's maybe a few firms that are really actively using it. So this is one part of the component that's leading up to what we're going to do today. There's, you know, just to get an idea, okay, VR has a pretty recent history of, you know, being more and more used and adapted, but still isn't quite through on the consumer market fully. Like there's probably none of you has a VR headset, I'm assuming. Does anybody have one? No? Okay. So see, it's even architects, even people who are working with 3D are kind of like, it's not quite there yet. But so the other thing that is interesting in terms of web-based VR is, you know, it's kind of this idea of creating worlds on the web, and that has a long history too. So this is just an image of you know, an 80s game, just to kind of get into your head. So how recently games looked very low res. And obviously now we have a much higher fidelity, but this is actually 96 Freesave is the first, or I don't know if the first, but a very popular web-based world-building game. So here you can see, you know, people really on you know, this idea that you can be on the browser, you can interact with others. So it was also a massive multiplayer game. So basically there were like, you know, I don't know how many, but definitely multiple people in there at the same time. Playing, and kind of seems like some kind of conquest game. I've never played it, but just to kind of give you context that, you know, people have been doing playing games on the web for a long time, just not really fully in 3D. So this is still a flat image that, you know, is an axle and it can be moved around, but it isn't actually fully three-dimensional and immersive. And that changed in 2003. 2003 was the year Second Life came out. I mean, it might have happened before, but Second Life was the first like really widely adopted game. So people who are already in architecture school at the time remember that Second Life was just like a huge thing, and every designer, everybody was doing something in Second Life. People thought that this is the future. There was a huge business model around it. People made money building stuff for Second Life, and it, as quickly as it sort of emerged as a trend, it also faded away pretty quickly. And I think most people, including me, kind of forgot about it until really this year. So 2020 was sort of the year when everyone suddenly remembered that Second Life exists, and supposedly even got more users than ever before. So they called it a pandemic boost, and all of a sudden, and it looked totally different. In the meantime, they had developed it like much further. There's like hundreds of worlds. I mean, it's still a massive undertaking. It feels kind of dated when you're in there, but it's still fascinating, just the fact that what people have created, because I think the reason why this was successful, I would say despite everything, you can consider it successful that 57 million people decided at some point to make an account. I mean, people were in it for years and years, was that people really had a huge amount of say over how this book is going to look like. So basically there were very few rules in that sense of what you could create, and people could customize everything from their avatars to the world that they were in. And again, this was all three-dimensional and on the web, so basically everybody could access it. Everybody could access it from their computer. You didn't need any specialized goggles or headset or anything for it. You could just be in there. Most recently, I mean, this was something that really like young kids from Brooklyn created these parties called Cringe, where they use Second Life in a totally, well, not new way. People have been throwing parties in there for a long time, but it was kind of like an unexpected combination of, fairly old technology, almost 20 years old technology with like a really contemporary music and, really kind of a new party that suddenly migrated onto that platform. And they combine it with other platforms like Twitch and YouTube, and here I really love that. That's from their website where they say party, chat, stream, right? So you basically, to have the full experience, you have to have a Twitch stream running, and so you would have the audio from there, and then you would have your avatar dancing in Second Life. So they really kind of combine these different modes to create an experience. So fast forward to today, there is actually quite a few different VR platforms that are social. And most of them came out, so you can see here, I put in the dates, within the last 5 years. So the first one was actually Altspace. And Altspace was, really an experiment of like, how can people coexist in VR, and with very enthusiastic user base, small but very enthusiastic user base, and everyone kind of felt passionate because it was something really new and exciting. But it was definitely startup that was financed by venture capitalists. And so what happened in 2017, essentially only 2 years after its existence, they ran out of money and they actually closed Altspace down. And the small community that was in it was completely distraught. And one of the developers that had worked on Altspace actually, and was out of a job, he was the person that then moved on to start building Mozilla Hubs. And I'll get into Mozilla Hubs in a second, but in the meantime, so again, I said 2016 was a crucial year for VR. This is when, some of the first consumer headsets came out, the Oculus, the HTC Vive. And so Sansar and VRChat are two kind of universes that have, slightly different flavor, basically a slightly different level of detail, but they work quite similarly, that you have to download a customized app, you have to have customized gear, but they also both work on the desktop. So you have kind of a mix of people who are using it on the desktop, and you have people who are using it in VR. But it really, so on a desktop, it kind of is actually very similar to Second Life, and in VR, you have like a totally different experience, because Second Life was never VR compatible, right? It was only on the desktop. And you see VRChat as a phenomenon. It has like, during the pandemic, it got up to 1,600 concurrent users, which is a lot for VR. And in any case, this is sort of the current landscape, which is also, I think, really interesting for architects to explore, just to go in and see what's up. Because anybody used any of these, or is that new? I'm curious. Newish. Okay, you should try. You should try because they're kind of fascinating worlds in themselves. But Mozilla Hubs, again, founded by this guy who kind of had, not founded, but he was the main, kind of the person leading the team. He basically had a realization, which is, if you create a social space that people actually care about, but that social space depends on funding by a totally third party, by some kind of investor, and that funding goes away, then all of a sudden you take away people's social connections. And so his mission was to kind of not let that happen and build a decentralized VR environment, a VR social environment that lives on the web, so that where you're not required to download any proprietary software, but the idea is that it's open source, so anybody can take the code and do whatever they want with it and build on it, add to it, change it, and also that it's not running on a single server, but becomes kind of like it's sort of this type of utopian idea that drove the early internet. And Mozilla was actually interested in the same ideas. They're kind of like a browser that was always interested in ideas of privacy and open internet, and so they were the ones to help him build it and support the infrastructure around it. So there's and I think linked, so you can also read the full essay, but here's basically his story of how he, basically what I just summed up, how he kind of went from a very from developing Outspace to going into Mozilla Hubs. And one really important thing here, when you're talking about social spaces, is the intentional versus unintentional co-presence, where I kind of come back to the water cooler. So in a lot of these online games and environments, you just go in, and same for Second Life, and you just run into strangers, and a lot of things can happen in that moment. So this would be unintentional co-presence, right? It can be pleasant, but it can also be kind of liberating to talk to a stranger on the internet, but it can also be really weird. And so the idea with Mozilla Hubs is that actually you create private rooms, so for specific audiences. And then within these private rooms, you can invite whoever you want and make it into events with people that you actually already know. In some way, it doesn't have to be actually know them in person, but they're part of a group, like for example, GSAPP. And so this is, intentional co-presence. And he makes a really important point here, which I think is relevant when thinking about these things, is that, this kind of social, whatever social environment we're creating in VR is all by design. So none of this is accidental. It might be not necessarily malintentioned, or people don't think about it, but like all these ways that people encounter each other in these spaces is absolutely a design thing. So another thing that's really important in Mozilla is that there's something called flexible identity. So you don't have to have one account with which you log in. So today, when Facebook launched the Quest, basically they also talked about Horizon, which is their new social VR platform, and there your avatar is tied to your Facebook profile. So basically, you're always, in the end, they can always trace you back to yourself. But in Mozilla Hubs, you can log in with as many accounts as you want. So you have a flexible identity, and you can sort of there's basically multiple versions of you that can enter and always have a different avatar. So there's really significant differences between these type of social spaces that are just important to consider. All right, so let's go into this space real quick all together, and then we'll start to have a little bit of a conversation with Matt, and we'll kind of and actually all of you, because there's not too many, so we can just chat about these issues. So if you click, you can either click here in the presentation, or I'll also send the link in inside of the chat here. Oh yeah, and so you're anyway muted, so you can probably hear the music from my. Okay. So here's the yeah. So the first link that I just sent again was the hubs link, and the second one. Oops. I just want to mute this here. Okay. So oh, where are you guys? Oh, here you are. I see Katie. I see a few different people. So here you see kind of like a sort of spa environment, and you can still see my screen, right? So when you come in, you probably already were asked to choose to have an avatar. Here on the left-hand side, you can always click here and set name and avatar, and you can change. You see, I'm being this weird little rod. So it's nice when you put your name in, because then that allows you to have other people know who you are. But again, you can also be anonymous if you prefer. And so you can also talk to other people, and you can test it with your friends afterwards. You can talk to other people within the hubs, and it's actually the distance you are to somebody actually matters. So you will hear them louder if you're closer to them, and if you're further away, they kind of fade away. So with large groups, actually like using Zoom for sound, and then just kind of walk around in here. So if you're a gamer, you're going to be familiar with it. If not, you can just use W to move forward, D to move right, and A left, and S to move backwards. So it's sort of like moving back and forth with the fingers. Or the same thing with arrow keys. If you press the G button, you can actually float. So with G, you can go up. So you probably see that I'm just fly mode. I'm floating up, and I can see the whole scene from above. Yeah, see, some of you are already flying. And the cool thing about this is that, you can, if you had a VR headset right now, you could also enter in VR and interact with all of us, but we are on our browsers, and you can actually look at it on your phone as well. So that's, a really exciting kind of hybrid model. Oh, did somebody put that? Oh, wow, I love that. I love that flaming avatar. It's really great. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted everyone to come in. Yeah, you can start playing around. You can kind of show emotions. You can chat at the bottom of the page, and you can also bring in 3D models here in the Create panel, and bring in images, bring in videos, stuff like that. But I'll go. I'll go at the end. I'll talk about the workflow of how to upload this model from Rhino. So it's going to be a quick demo, but I just wanted everybody to kind of see it first before we talk too much. I'm going to go back to the presentation. Now everybody's distracted, which is good. So, all right. If you go on my screen, so one firm that has been doing really interesting work in that area is called Space Popular or Popular, I don't know. They recently did an exhibition at the REBA in London, and it got canceled midway because it was open through February, and then they built another hub, basically a hubs version for it. And this is so far the best hubs I've seen, the best kind of hubs use I've seen so far. So the hubs room is linked to this image in the presentation. So if you're curious, just go ahead and explore this maybe after, because it's really a nice way of playing with sort of real elements and then also virtual elements, and kind of like, I mean, there's a lot more to be done, and hopefully some of you will create totally different things, but at least in terms of now when everything's very fresh. And they made this also, very quickly in May. It was sort of like one of the first things that was brought out in this kind of social VR space. And yeah, definitely something interesting to explore. And they also created this room for the AA, kind of like an exhibition space It's called the A Earth Gallery, and basically was just kind of an atrium in which you can walk around and look at different drawings from the AAA. And here another example. This is where I got my avatar. It's called Area, and again you can click on the link, and they have this really cool thing. I don't know yet how they did that. I really want to figure it out. But basically, you can click on an avatar and become that avatar. So you see they have these really cute blobs and stuff. So if you're interested in that, in not having, because you know that Mozilla avatars are kind of not that pretty. So here you can become a little bit more artsy, I guess. And this is actually the beginning of a really large project. It's a Viennese group, and they're commissioning all these VR artworks, and also have a Mozilla Hubs version for it, so you can really go explore. There's videos, there's different worlds that you can enter. So one important thing, what you can do in Hubs, you can link worlds. You know, you can sort of connect them to each other. It's basically like a portal or like a gate. So you can kind of create a lobby space and then kind of enter all these other worlds through it. So, you know, for those of you, you know, who are thinking, okay, kind of curious, maybe I want to buy a headset. I would say they kind of come at all price points, really. You can you know, get cardboard, which is like $10, and you can use it with a phone, and it gives you kind of at least an idea of VR. And especially, you know, in architecture, maybe if you're just mostly interested in previewing spaces, this is totally not a, you know, it's not a bad investment, I would say, just to even get a taste for it. Then there's kind of like a mid-range type of VR where you can, they're also phone-based, so basically you put your phone that creates the image and then translates it into VR. And there's some of them that actually have controllers too, so you have like some level of interaction, because obviously the cardboard is not really, you know, interactive with your environment. At the moment, and again, you know, with all my critique of Oculus, it is the only wireless headset, or the only one that I know of. There's probably more, but the one that is kind of widely adopted that is wireless means you don't need to have to be kind of tethered to a PC, or you don't need to have any trackers installed. You can just walk around freely, and you have these controllers with which you're fully interactive with your hands. So for playing games, for navigating spaces, for all that stuff, it's a really, really good headset. And then there's the high-end versions, which like, you know, the Index and the HTC Vive, and those, they're really powerful, and you can play like really high-end graphics with them. I mean, obviously the Mozilla Hubs is sort of, it's a little bit low res, right? It's still sort of, because it's so platform independent, because it works on so many different things, it also, you know, doesn't have such a great visual quality. But if you want to go for the high-end stuff, those are the headsets. But for me, it always felt like, you know, that's just too much of an investment. But yeah, I think even with the lower end, to kind of mid-range headsets, you can really get a taste for it and start kind of thinking how VR can impact your practice. Okay, we'll talk about the workflow a little bit later. I'm actually gonna now give over to Matt to talk a little bit about our the project that we worked on in February, and sort of, you know, talk a little bit about his thoughts and some of the projects that he's been thinking about in recent months.
Thanks, Mika. So I've been kind of looking at this stuff bubble up a little bit in the last couple years. Before COVID, there was this kind of like alternative, I would say this like artists working this in alternative ways, using digital platforms to kind of get around the difficulty of displaying either at commercial galleries or big institutions, because they're just kind of difficult to penetrate. So they were creating their own sort of online spaces for displaying art and working with art. And it's something that I've been kind of like paying a lot of attention to, and now that and now in some of my conversations with Mika as well, we've kind of gotten into this together now, And I wanted to explain, talk a little bit about the exhibition that we did in February. And it was, I guess it kind of grew out of that interest in this world of people kind of creating these like digital social spaces. Um, um, and I don't know can you play the website here? Yeah,
Um,
so I guess
oh, actually,
first off,
it's not linked, but I can just open it up. So, oh, oh, it's on.
I guess this idea of digital social space kind of started with, before you do that,
Right, it's
Bika,
not working right now.
yeah, it's okay. We can do that after actually. So if you go to Josh's slide,
Mhm.
the idea of digital social space kind of started, back in 2016 when the presidential election happened, and there was all this kind of um, back and forth about the uh, politics of information and how people are using information to kind of influence politics and influence geopolitics. So, I mean, we all like heard about how there were, potentially or definitely information campaigns happening around the 2016 election to, influence one way or the other. And it kind of comes from this idea that, information is now kind of a new, kind of new territory that people, that's kind of one of the main ways now that politics happens. We still see traditional warfare and people taking territory, but a lot of it is now even more and more just information wars. And so I think this idea makes it super territorial. It makes it spatial. That there would be these like transnational kind of um, information wars. And so online, that looks a lot like the previous slide. That's people on Instagram kind of creating these like insane identities where they're like anarcho-primitivist, communist, traditional. Um, they just make up all these crazy ideologies that don't make sense together, like libertarian monarchism or anarcho-socialist syndicalist. I mean, it's almost like a game that they play to kind of like come up with the most weird identity. But I think it speaks to this kind of the spatial aspect of this stuff is that people are gathering online in spaces like Instagram and 4chan, and basically anywhere on the internet becomes this kind of like breeding ground for this sort of information to be exchanged and ideologies to be developed and disseminated and people to be radicalized and sort of building consensus. So we no longer need the kind of like salon in Paris to gather to exchange ideas and exchange these types of things. So a researcher named Josh Citarella kind of gets into this stuff. And I really see his work quite similarly to like forensic architecture or someone like, I don't know if you're all familiar with like the 2016 Oslo Triennale, where most of those projects were kind of like mapping projects or these sort of like goldsmiths in London style, forensic architecture style analysis of these territories and what's happening. So these using spatial knowledge to like capture what's happening in the world and display it in a new way. So I kind of see Josh's work as venturing into these new territories of social media, of the dark recesses of the internet to find these kinds of communities. So where these communities are being built and fostered becomes a kind of territorial, kind of like spatial research project. And so one of the works in the Arsenal that we commissioned was he took that and sort of made it physical by using these flags. He had these flags made on Etsy. So he found these flags that these kids online had created, these identities that they had been working together on, and found these and made them into physical objects. So these are real flags that were created by people, and then he printed them out And people display these, like, it's actually a thing that kids do too. They print these things out and display them in their rooms and stuff like that. It's almost like concert posters now for kids. You know, Generation Z kind of uses politics almost as like pop culture. So I guess the spatiality of this project is what I wanted to kind of bring up, because this online social space is what has been kind of fostering these new communities, especially in an era, I think, where social media is maybe losing some of its ground as a place where real discussion happens. I think people are getting a little bit tired of the toxicity of social media and the kind of like just the way people talk on there. Sometimes I think people are less comfortable having, and so people have been trying to find these kind of semi-public spaces, you might say. So they're like places like Discord, where you need an invitation to join, or the places and the spaces that Bika was describing, I think are right along those lines, where people are sort of in these new, smaller online environments to foster community and bring together people in a way. So one example of that was actually, if you go to the next one, Bika, I think maybe it makes more sense this way. So one example of that is this this group of artists, and you can find these videos on the FIDI website. This is Philip Kostick's work, and we commissioned this one as well because he had been going on World of Warcraft, and he and a bunch of his friends were walking around in World of Warcraft. And this is pre-pandemic. They just played World of Warcraft, but it was a lot of art people, and so they were like hanging out on World of Warcraft and making art critique and talking about art in World of Warcraft. So rather than getting together at like a bar like they would have in the 60s or something, people are now doing this in these game spaces. And so gathering in this online environment, and you can see the video and see what it's about, because it's pretty funny. I would definitely recommend watching it. It's really funny.
Yeah, you need to watch it to get it. It's like he's walking around the game and commenting, as if it's like a fine art show. It's really quite a unique thing.
It's really funny, and it's really critical of the art world and kind of art speak. And it's just, I mean, it's actually quite produced through gathering in a game space. And so I think these kind of spaces they're happening, and that's why I think it's important for you guys to know about this stuff, because it's these kind of online communities are already forming, whether or not architects are involved. And so it's not so much how architects can change this phenomenon or anything, or what we can learn from it. It's more like, how could we engage with it and use it to, or help it? Like, how can we make it better by using our architectural knowledge and skills to, build out these spaces to be interesting places for people. So another example of the kind of work in the Arsenale around these social spaces was this work by Pierce Myers, who was a student at Strelka, and he was working on taking some of Josh's work about these kind of eco futures and these political futures, and making it three-dimensional with all this, with using game engines and narrative building and filmmaking. He's a student of Liam Young as well. So kind of building these worlds out into places, they're really places that hold these kind of political ideologies and these ideas within them. So similar to Philip's piece, it kind of creates these like online environments for social and political action, and not necessarily activism, but just kind of community building and political futurism, let's say. And so I think in those ways, architects have an opportunity to see these spatial phenomenon and kind of engage with them in an interesting way now through the tools that Bika's showing you. I think these kinds of projects, these multimedia projects, these social spaces, they really need, you know, architects to engage with them and work on them. And there's a lot of potential out there, because there's a lot of really innovative things happening in these spaces, especially, you know, in Mozilla Hubs and in VR chat. And just a couple other kind of fun examples of these kind of things I think you might enjoy. Like, these people gathered in Tom Clancy's video game called The Division, which is a kind of dystopian multiplayer game on set in New York City. And they went around and this one guy gave a tour of New York City in the game to his friends. So they made this video of it, and it's just kind of a fun video, but it shows the kind of experimental nature of these spaces, that these spaces actually are places that, even though they're virtual and not built, are incredibly urban and architectural. They're kind of public spaces in a way that I think deserve architects' attention and could provide a kind of new platform for people to project a pretty radical architecture onto, as it, you know, it does a lot of the things that paper architecture did, where it can escape the limits of gravity and time, and, you know, the time it takes to build something and the cost to build something. So these worlds can be constructed quite elaborately, and these narratives can be built using these new tools that I think opens up the possibilities for entirely new types of architecture.
And also debate and also discussion. I think what's interesting about this piece is so in that sense, a little bit similar to Philip Kostik's piece, where these people talk about it in terms of like art historical terms. It's like, oh, look at this modernist building over there, right? Where you're so used, but then they look like first-person shooters, but walk around in it. So, but I think that's also very interesting how discourse suddenly is based on these games, or you know, so even if it's ironic, I think it still has, it's like a new angle on how you can even discuss architecture, right? Like, if you could also do it non-ironically, it could also be a really interesting way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the most, these examples are like extremely experimental because all this stuff's very early, but you can see as this things that Vika showed you, also they're starting to become more necessary in this, not only during COVID, but I think, you know, I would never want to advocate for this as like as like a new reality. It would really suck if this is like mandatory now that we have to do everything in virtual spaces. But they do offer us an alternative, and a really appealing alternative that can be, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this space going forward to imagine new ways of building that, as you said, don't have to be ironic, and they don't have to be so goofy, because they're kind of like that because they're super experimental, I think, at this early stage. Similar to this next one, it's I can send it in the chat. This is called New Art City, and it's a whole platform. It's a custom platform that they've had several shows in this platform, but you can get a sense, I think, in here of kind of the potential of what these kinds of places can look like with incorporating a lot of multimedia, incorporating videos and sound and text and kind of hyperlinks in space, where people don't have to just move through a space linearly. They can now jump from place to place, as same as in Mozilla, as Vika mentioned. But you can kind of get a sense, if you click that link, of all the different possibilities of how these things can be so kind of enriched by multimedia that physical space can't be.
It's here. This one is linked also. Yeah, this one is interesting because it's actually using a different framework than Mozilla, but it also has, you know, the same qualities of being on the web and being interactive, and actually has is a little bit more elegant. I mean, the one thing about Mozilla, if you use the default versions, oh, I'm just trying to button down. If you use the default versions, you know, it just has a certain aesthetic to it, which is somewhat limiting. And so here you can see an example of somebody who built a custom framework for it, but which is, you know, in itself great, but not possible for every project, I guess. Especially when, you know, you're in architecture school and you're trying to make something quick, but it's definitely kind of pushing. This is another example of sort of pushing Web 3D, you know, to a new frontier. Which also, this project is very recent too, right? Do you know when it came out?
They've been doing shows since April, but this one that's on the screen right now is super recent. It's like last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's also an interesting distinction too. Is like, I mean, I think that the VR stuff that you showed is really one type of this kind of digital social space, but there's also, I think these flat screen, the ones that are just on your browser are also another type as well. So I don't know, like really, there's like big differences between them too, but I think they kind of operate in the same way, socially, and bringing people in. And the ones in the browser may be a bit more anonymous. I'm not sure. But, and a little bit easier to enter and exit without kind of, but that's something also that Vika, you've been talking about, is like the kind of how certain platforms, I mean, this is all kind of wrapped up in platform discourse as well, like the politics of each platform and how do they, you've been talking a little bit about how Facebook is trying to get you to sign into their Facebook to use Oculus, which then sort of keeps it, I mean, the most cynical, it, you know, reifies, you know, existing social relationships or existing hierarchies, but at its most, like, you know, maybe at very least it holds it back, I think, from being a place of real, you know, it just kind of holds it back from being a place of fantasy, and holds back its potential as like a creative space where you could make up your own character or like not have a character and just float around. I guess the platform is a big question here.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it will differentiate itself. I mean, the internet also, you know, it again, it reminds me of earlier versions of the internet. You know, I guess I'm old enough at this point to remember when the internet was kind of wild and unregulated in some way, and or at least had the promise of it. You know, I don't know if it ever really was, but it just had, at least conceptually, people saw it as this space that would have that kind of freedom embedded, and they would live outside of, you know, that kind of would pose a sort of alternate reality, or not just virtual reality, but also alternate. Because I think the interesting thing about virtual reality in a broader sense is, you know, you can define how much that virtual reality is actually replicating reality or totally disassociating from it. And even in the examples we saw tonight, you know, I think there's such a range, but it can be, I think that is still such a wide open field to be explored. And I think with, you know, Facebook and social media as we know it now, actually those profiles are becoming almost more real than we are. They're kind of replacing reality, and I think that's where it gets really tricky, right? And so with VR, I think those things are still to be defined a little bit, and there's going to be, you know, a plethora of approaches, but that's why it's an exciting moment in my eyes to you know, think through it as an architect also, and think through the possibilities of how we can keep that imaginary space open for ourselves and use it in this moment of innocence or you know, almost
yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting time for it right now, because we're kind of being forced to develop it, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes after. Like, does it become like alternatives, or does it become like, are there uses of it that are like we need, I guess, is what I'm wondering. Like, something that's going to be kind of like an art world phenomenon that Yeah, it becomes like a, you know, a genre, or is it going to be like something like real that finance people feel like they need, and it becomes developed?
If you listen to the people that are developing it right now, you know, they're thinking of it in all kinds of ways. Like again, that guy who's developing Mozilla, who, you know, I think is very thoughtful about it, but he sees it as he feels so responsible to create Mozilla, not because it's a fun art project, because he believes that, you know, the way that VR is going to inhabit people's lives is going to be so essential that he's afraid of the power of the big companies that are decentralized, privatized companies that are basically are going to be able to control that personal life of people. Because essentially, if socializing is, if public life and socializing is happening in VR, even if it's just 1% of it, you know, at some point in a few years. And what if it's 10%? What if, you know, what if like, what if we spend the amount of time that we spend in social media on VR, and then, but then that is controlled to even much higher degree by these kind of companies, because they can track your, you know, your bio data, they can track your eye movement, they can just, it's just like opens up so much more control from these companies, and so much more addictive, kind of allows for so much more addictive behavior and emotional attachment to these worlds. I mean, even just from the amount of time I've spent in VR in the last few months since I got a VR headset, you know, I mean, it's not as extreme because there's not that many people I know who are in VR, but I can totally imagine it at this point that people would get really emotionally attached to VR. And I mean, in the research for this class, I found these old videos which are really funny to watch, where people talk about internet addiction in the 90s, where they're like, oh my God, this person spends up to 30 hours a week on the internet. And I'm like, who does not today? Like that, every person by that definition would be an internet addict. So I do think that, you know, just thinking a little bit back historic, like looking at it historically and thinking where things go, and seeing at least what the people developing intend to do, you know, as architects, as spatial thinkers, as designers, it's absolutely crucial to address it. And it's not anymore this sort of niche thing, or, you know, or it's again, we'll see. Maybe history will prove me wrong, and the whole thing and yeah, will completely disappear. But
Yeah.
I'm curious also from those listening right now, if you guys have questions or thoughts on what you saw.
I guess I'm wondering if have either of you thought at all about, because I think the way we're speaking about using VR is we design something, you know, in architecture school, let's say, we design something that has, you know, the sort of idea of being in the real world, and we kind of temporarily place it in VR to like test it out. But do you think that but that and we sort of like deal with the, you know, the sort of clunkiness and low res or whatever, just because it's like a preview kind of, as you were saying. But do you think that in fact, then when we go to the norm, you know, let's say we were building our school projects, you know, which we're obviously not, but the VR would have no impact essentially on the built form? Like, is there a version, like maybe in the future, where it's less of like a, you know, one directional workflow and more like VR actually comes to inflect built form?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I would say that, you know, tools are always inflecting built form, and tools are not agnostic. And I mean, you're right. If it just becomes this very last step after you've fully designed it, and it's really just a render button, maybe it's a little different. But as soon as it will become a little more integrated in the design process, which I think it will, right? I mean, we're going to look at Spoke in a second, which is the kind of editor to create VR. You know, it's such a it's actually about to be a full 3D environment. So why would you actually do these things in Rhino if you could just do it online, where you could do it in real time and then translate it straight into a model that can be shared. So it's a little bit like, to me it's a bit of a similar question. Has Google Docs changed how we write? I would say yes. You know, because all of a sudden I can send it and share it and edit it, and 10 people can write at the same time. And WebVR, basically, you know, Mozilla Hub, hopefully if they develop it this way, or if not, it's going to be another company building something similar, but the tools are all there. They just need to get a little bit better and a little bit more streamlined. But so if you think of it that way, and not just as a purely representational tool, but think of it as like something that can interactively be used to design stuff with other people, I think it definitely will have an impact on the built environment just through the way of using the tool. And there's probably deeper implications as well, you know, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good question for sure. It's you know, definitely would be, yeah. I actually didn't want this to kind of seem like, oh, this is just a representation tool, because I do think that in the end, you know, any representation tool is also a design tool in some capacity.
I think also one thing that we've seen during COVID, and the Space Popular thing, I think, is a good example of this, and our 5 Hour Sonali show is a good example of this. There's a lot of like kind of recreating things that already exist as a kind of stand-in for it, which maybe would have been funnier or more interesting before COVID, but now it's just like sad and scary. But it's but I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have. But I think a lot of the discourse around that sort of recreation of a place makes a lot of sense now. That those recreations make sense now, because let's say the Cooper Union final show got shut down, so they had to just rebuild it and so it was essentially just the Cooper Union show in the Cooper Union building in Unity, and therefore they it was a quite nice exhibition where you could see and click on the videos and see information. It was sort of an augmented experience, let's say. But I think that the time for that it starts to get a little bit tiresome, probably, to have these like simulations or approximations of existing spaces. And probably the more powerful examples of all of this in the future would be things like some of the other Mozilla hubs that you were showing, Pika, that kind of obliterate any reality and create these new places where digital content can be displayed natively, and therefore it's not it's being seen as it should be seen, or it's designed to be seen in that space. So something like yeah, I mean, it just opens up a lot of possibilities for like how you display digital artworks. And that's kind of only an art world, but I could see it applying to like architect, more traditional spaces too, where maybe there's like a hybrid space or AR space or something where you start to think about not just like, as you said, Katie, like approximating something that already exists, but like fully using that medium to like bring out the qualities of the medium, of the tools.
Yeah, I mean, as you were speaking, I was also thinking the other thing that I think will become maybe more relevant is that, people will design buildings, but also at the same time think of digital twins as not necessarily replicas, but you would have a physical building and then you would also have a virtual version in some way that can be an adaptive or expanded version of that physical space. So, if you think of an art gallery, or that's just what's on my mind, or any really for other programs you can imagine. I mean, we're doing it with school right now, right? Like our virtual spaces are Zoom, because we haven't redesign anything better. I mean, Zoom is fine, but you know, like, we're inhabiting kind of default spaces at the moment. But why don't we also design them? And so, but then I think with specific physical spaces, it's already happening in the form of websites, right? Like most physical spaces have a web address as well. So if you think it further in terms of spatial web VR, you could also think of like a spatial representation on the web. And I think that if you design these two together, they will also potentially influence each other or interfere with each other. And the other way that VR is influencing space right now, which is really funny, maybe a very temporary version, but people are, including me, removing furniture from their spaces to clear out a VR area, right? So suddenly you have, you're totally redoing your living room because you need just open space for the infinite vastness of the internet. And so that's different, right? And so maybe that could be, I mean, that's kind of a small scale thing in a way, because, well, or not, right? Like, if you think of larger VR interactions, and if that becomes a centerpiece of people's lives, then you would have to rethink how apartments are laid out, and you would have to come. Anyway, but this is, yeah, it's another physical, you know, hybrid condition between the physical and the virtual.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Or the twin concept. I mean, even like, you know, there's always an exhibition catalog book that goes with a physical exhibit, and that seems totally normal. So why would there not be like this kind of digital twin with the, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, we'll see post-pandemic. Only the twins.
Actually, in our case, Vika, well, maybe you could pull up the website, Vika, because it's pretty raw.
It's actually .org.
It's pretty raw, but I think we wanted to do this before the pandemic, because the reason we wanted to do it is because the show was only allowed to be up for a month, and we were like, well, we should build something online that'll last forever, or more than a month. And so we wanted to build it out so people could see it. And so Vika 3D scanned the space, and then some programmers made it into, they used Unity to build it out into like a playable game online in the browser. And it's kind of it's actually a high-res version of it, even though it's gray. But you can go and visit all the artworks, and you can kind of see the layout of the space. So the relationship of the objects to the space and the objects to each other kind of remains, and you get the idea of the show more than you would just from a catalog. So I think in that sense, it is sort of a catalog, actually, like a really hypermedia catalog. You can see, exhibition documentation, but actually most of the video works you can just see. And so in that regard, now it seems kind of annoying because it seems like just another one of these shows, but it actually was meant to be more like, it was more like a critique of how hard it is to have space for a long time. So it was like, well, we can't have this space for more than a month, so we'll just make our own space with all this stuff. Kind of stage it at the location for a month and then broadcast it online.
Yeah. And then it got caught up in everybody trying to do scrambling. But yeah, I mean, as much as this was, you know, maybe something that I was trying to do, I'm sure that the next round is going to be a lot more interesting in terms of how people will approach it, you know, and have learned from these approaches. Because I think that before the pandemic, it seemed almost like VR and this kind of, or at least sort of 3D worlds didn't seem that the need wasn't so clear in a way, and so, you know, kind of also not thinking. I think people were limited to what they could imagine that physically able-bodied people would do. So I think this is a little personal, but when I realized during the pandemic, okay, I would not be able to go to all these things physically. I would always be in that situation. And there's a lot of people who are, you know, in fact, in that situation. And so expanding access in that way, I think, is also a bigger a bigger mission or bigger question of this type of media. All right. Oh wow, it's already 8:20. So so for those who are interested, I would quickly show the Spoke workflow, but I can also, it depends a little bit because it's already late. I can also record it and just send it as a video. How do you guys feel? Do you want to still see it, or do you feel like we should just wrap it up slowly because it's been a long night? I'm happy either way. If you want to see the Spoke, just do this. I want to see it. Okay, let's do it then for Matt. So yeah, might as well. Right?
5 minutes to get a drink of water.
What?
We just take like a 5-minute drink of water.
Oh, take a 5-minute water break. Yeah, let's take a. I'll just. You can just walk away. I'm just gonna start the Rhino file just to take a second to set up anyway. So here's the scene that we saw earlier, and it's, you know, as you see, it's a pretty simple Rhino file, pretty straightforward actually, but basically it texture maps all the materials onto these sort of primary shapes. And in this case, I mean, this is just because I wanted to have a little bit of a handwritten feel to it. Hi, Celeste. Thanks for tuning in. So because I wanted to have a handwritten feel to it, I actually just wrote those by hand and photographed them and texture mapped them onto the objects. Because in VR, again, in this sort of hybrid spirit of connecting between the physical and the virtual, I felt like often these kind of hub spaces that already are very abstracted, so I wanted to give it a kind of haptic touch. So, and this is a NURBS model. And so most of you, when you're modeling in Rhino, you're going to be modeling in NURBS. And there's a really, really important distinction. So when you want to upload stuff to the web, you have to use meshes. And I have a full 1-hour lecture on YouTube that I can send you if you're interested, that you could watch, where I talk about the differences between NURBS and meshes. And I feel like it's essential knowledge for every architect to know, but I feel, unfortunately, in architecture school, still a lot of people don't quite get the idea. But the main thing you need to know is that before you can upload this, you just need to turn it into a mesh, and there's a very, very convenient command in Rhino, which is called mesh. So you can select your geometry. So you can really just select everything at once. It depends a little bit how heavy your model is. This is a pretty clean model. As you see, there's not too much extra geometry. So this will go pretty quickly, and you just hit mesh. And here you see the dialog. You see like how many polygons you'll get, and you can choose the preview to kind of see the density. So you can go for, you know, a high density of polygons or few polygons, but basically you just want to have a mesh density that is smooth enough that things don't look kind of jagged and low res, but high, but not too high, so your file size doesn't get too big. So here you start seeing that this is actually, you know, pretty good, the medium range. So, you know, usually I go with the app, like the medium range, and then if the file size is too big, then I start going down from there. But again, it depends a little bit on the model. So here I have an already meshed model. One thing that you need to be aware of when you create your mesh. So right now, in this original model, when I have the mesh and the surface, they're actually, the mesh and the NURBS, they're actually overlapping. So right now it looks the same, but when you click on them, you can select mesh or polysurface. So when you're exporting it, you don't want to just export everything. You want to actually just select the meshes and export these, because you know, otherwise you'll have everything double, and it's going to make your file unnecessarily heavy. So as you see, this is a little Mozilla Hub setup where I built an environment around it. You could also leave that away and just have it open in like infinite space, but it's nice, you know, to be a little bit contained. So here you have, you know, I can build just a simple dome and put a texture on it. And here use a water kind of texture in Mozilla Hub. So this is just open at the, kind of leaving it open and anticipating that I'm going to be using kind of like a iterative water texture that appears here. So another important thing you have to think about in Rhino before you export is your model should be in scale 1:1 in meters. And that's not because I'm European, it's just a Mozilla thing. I don't know why they chose meter is the default scale. So if you have your model in inches or whatever other units, just go to type units and then you can change it to meters in there. So, you know, it's already in meters here, but accept whatever scale, you know, if it says, should I scale it times so and so, just accept that, and then it'll be in the right scale and you come into hubs. And scale is important in hubs because you will be experiencing it in sort of first person perspective. And so, you know, when your model is too small or too big, it's not going to be working for you. And that's really it. So that's, you know, those are the main things you need to understand before you're exporting it. And the file format to export it, and actually I'm going to go back to that slide really quick that I skipped over earlier, because that one hopefully explains it kind of succinctly. So here, you know, you're in Rhino, you turn it into a mesh, and then you export it as an OBJ into Blender. And Blender is a open source modeling software that you know, is awesome and that allows you to export the OBJ into a GLTF. And the GLTF is kind of web mesh format that can be readable by Spoke, and Spoke is sort of the editor, the kind of 3D web editor from which you publish into hubs. So it's really just, you know, these sort of, it's these two steps, because this one is just, you just click and it goes. You don't have to do anything, any translation here, but it's unfortunately, it's not just import, export, it's import, it's export, import, export, import. But anyway, this will soon hopefully be a little bit more streamlined. I don't think that, because, you know, the reason that this is like that is because Rhino is not a mesh modeler. And I looked on the forums, and it seems like at least in the near future, GLTF is not in planned for Rhino, but we'll see. Maybe if there's a critical mass, if everyone starts using Mozilla Hubs, maybe they'll build it as a plugin. So you export it as an OBJ. I'm just gonna assume that you know how to export stuff in Rhino. If not, you just select all. You say export selected, and then choose OBJ as a file format. Then you open up Blender, and I will just save this file and make a new file so you get the whole experience. So one thing that happens, this is not, as you see, I'm not, oh here. As you see, I'm not a Blender expert actually, but you don't need to do much in Blender actually. In this case, it's really just kind of a travel through spot. So in Blender, you go to File, Import, and then choose OBJ. And here, I have here my tutorial, and I have my island file that I exported earlier. So it will look something like this. And this is just a default box. You can delete that Blender kind of for some reason already puts into your file. So here you see your object, and it loses textures, but don't worry about it. The textures are just not previewed, but the textures are actually still there. For some reason, Blender doesn't want to display it. Don't worry about it. If, you know, in Spoke, you'll actually know if the textures have arrived or not. So next step, very simple. Don't do anything, just hit export, and then here you have the GLB or GLTF exporter. So here, I'm gonna make a new folder for it. Hubs, and then here, so you can say selected objects if you don't want to export the whole model. And then if you're working with animation, you can also choose your settings here, but by default, you just export the whole scene. And so next thing, in Mozilla Spoke, so Spoke is the web editor. Oops. So this is where I already, this is the scene that we saw earlier, kind of like fully ready. just want to show you how it looks when the scene is done. And I want to just make a new scene just so that you get the workflow done. So here, this is the web access hubs.mozilla.com/spoke or -spoke. So here you see my dashboard. I already have a few different scenes that I've tried out. So you just hit new project, and then you get a few defaults, which are usually not overly attractive. They're kind of weird. I usually like starting with the wide open space, because if you just click new empty project, it actually gives you a weird landscape. So, you know, wide open space is kind of like the most neutral one. So here, and here we have a few things already in the scene. So we have spawn points, and we have a 3D editor that looks pretty familiar to what we kind of know. What is a spawn point? So remember when we teleport, when you click the hubs link, you arrived into a particular point, and that's the spawn point. So basically that's the kind of you know, wherever people are arriving is going to be the spawn point. So this scene already has 4 points for some reason, but I don't need all 4. I just want to have 1. So here you see the hierarchy. So basically everything that is in this scene is going to be listed on in this tab, which is pretty nice because, you know, it's kind of like a simple overview in terms of everything that's in there. So now I can, down here, I have all kinds of different elements. So there is, and that's actually kind of to Katie's question earlier in terms of creating, you know, things in VR. So there's actually an architecture kit. So you could, you know, I mean, I don't know, let's see, that you could technically build a design fully here. There's like stairs and all kinds of like defaults, but generally you have your own assets. And here you see things that I've uploaded in the past are all here archived, which is really convenient, you know. Once I've uploaded something, it's going to be here forever. And I have 3D models, I have images, haven't uploaded any videos yet, but I could. And if I have custom audio for the scene, I can also upload it here. So my assets is basically everything I've uploaded is kind of collected. And elements includes all the kind of default elements that, you know, Spoke is giving me to work with. But so to import my file that I saved out earlier, I just have to find the folder, tutorial. And so, sorry, I saved it in the other one. Should have cleaned the desktop. No, wait. Well, actually, it doesn't matter. It's also been exported here because I did the same thing before. So here, so you can see the. So here are my GLB files. So here's the OBJ version, and then here's the GLB file. So I can just drag and drop it in, and that's really the crucial point. It's super easy. You don't need to do anything fancy, just drag and drop stuff. And you know, it's like, so if you're under 20 megabytes, that's like a really good size. If you you can probably go a little bit heavier. You saw that the scene that we went in earlier was loaded pretty quickly, so it overall had maybe like 30 megabytes of data. Because I also have these animations, basically animated these objects floating up and down. And of course now, because it's a demo, it's loading really slowly. So, but that's why I kind of preloaded the scene. It kind of worked a little faster before. But the important crucial point is for geometry, just drag it and drop it onto the scene, and then it will appear in the scene with textures, and even if it didn't preview properly. So, you know, in wide open space, you can set things like the fog. So here you see the fog effect is something that is really helpful because, you know, there's not too much without fog. This whole scene looks a lot less romantic. So that is right here in the wide open space. So in assets, I guess it's one of these things where you just should play around a little bit. You know, I also just, there's not too many tutorials out there yet, but there's some videos you can access. There's the particle emitters. That's how I generated these bubbles coming up, and the way it works is you know, if you've been using any kind of 3D software, like 3D Max is quite similar. You have here the stack, the hierarchy stack of all the different elements, and then you can upload an image, any kind of PNG, and then create particles within there. And you can play around with scale, randomness, and how many emitters are coming out. And similarly down here, you have simple water, which is essentially just a plane you put in and it automatically generates water. So it's still a kind of a little bit limited range of objects. So I've also created little animations, just simple sort of like up and down movements for these volumes. If you want to get into animation, that's like a slightly longer tutorial. You know, hit me up. I'm happy to explain it to you. But essentially, you need to animate the objects in Blender and then bake the animation in and bring it into hubs, and then that's going to be part of your scene. So yeah, but essentially, you know, if you really just want to do get the geometry going, this is the step you bring in a GLT. One thing that I really love is bringing music. So here you have audio, so you can just click the audio button and drop it into the scene. And then, so I already had an audio in there, so this is my second audio. But the nice thing is, it's so simple. You just copy paste the URL, and I'm going to delete this one because I already had one, but I can show you the one that I already had. So I just used a SoundCloud. Any SoundCloud, like public SoundCloud link will work. So just like, you know, a kind of mix that I like that I thought would fit this sort of calm atmosphere. And that's it. And then, but the audio, what's important to know about the audio is that it's spatialized. So basically, if you get closer to the audio, you can notice if you walk around the hub scene, when you get closer to that point where it is right now, so that's why I put it kind of central, because I wanted it to just be heard everywhere. It's going to be louder. And down here, you can control the volume. You can make it louder, and you can even control the distance model and how far off into the distance. So here, the maximum distance is like, you know, 10,000, it goes really far, 10,000 meters. But you can also decide if you have complex models in multiple rooms, you could have the audio only in a very small radius and within a small room. Yeah, and then you have, you know, lights. You can play around with different lights. Again, the lighting is not super advanced yet. There's like, you know, not too many shading options, and there's no ambient occlusion and stuff like that. So if you want to have more advanced lighting things like ambient occlusion, you would have to bake that into the textures and bring the textures in. But yeah. So when you're done, you know, kind of want to see a first version, you just hit publish to hubs, and then it will basically transfer the scene into hubs. And now it's like a little bit, I think it's thinking too much. my laptop, okay, laptop might be overloaded from all the things that are happening. But this is exactly the scene that we saw earlier. So, you know, once you hit publish to hubs, it just goes through, okay, because this is still uploading. I want to close this one. So exactly, so with publish to hubs, actually I turned off the fog. Let's not do that. Bring the fog back. So it generates a little screenshot. You can give it a name, and then exports the scene out. And, you know, again, you want to always be careful of making big files, because it'll just amplify the problems. So here you see, it gives you kind of feedback of how well you did in terms of following guidelines. So my polygon count is pretty good. I do have like 57 unique materials because I really wanted these handwritten textures on everything, but that's fine. That's important for my project. And file size, it's like, you know, it's giving me like a little bit of complaint, but it's okay. Medium is fine. So with architects, you'll never be like 100% efficient. But it's kind of nice that it gives you, you know, gives you grades of how well you did. So now you can go and view your scene, and you want to create a room with your scene. And that's it. Then, you know, it loads it in hubs, and then you can enter your scene and share it with other people. Any questions from you guys about this? So you see, this is the spawn point. This is where the little, and I can move the guy around, right? So here in my list somewhere. Now there's like, okay, so here's the spawn point. And you see here, if I move this character, and I can also decide the orientation, which way they're looking. So I can also have them, you know, kind of further away or some, whatever works for the scene. And this is, so if I republish it, this is going to be the spot where I would come out. Yeah, questions? Oh, I landed in the water somehow. Yeah, I guess maybe we leave it at that. And then I am planning to make videos for the skills trail, so that you know you have kind of a permanent access to these videos, and I'll also take this lecture and demo on YouTube, or can upload it to YouTube so you can find it. Oh, the animation. Okay, so I can show it real quick if you guys are still, if you want to hold on. I was just worried it would get too long, but it's a small but captive audience here. I like it. So I did it in Blender. So here I can just show you. So back to Blender, go into the OBJ. And here I just had these little, you know, just copy and add whatever, 1, 2, 3. So this is one of the shapes that I animated. And so basically Blender, you know, I've never used it before, but I just looked up simple animation tools. And the way it works, you have a timeline down here, you press I, and with I, you create a keyframe for location. And then you can go to, like, you know, 100 or whatever time frame you want to have. You move it, and then you press I again, and press location again. Then you move it to, but you know, because you want to have a continuous movement, you want to move it back to its original position, because then it will just loop. You move it back, you press I again, and you press location. So, but that's not enough. Just animating. So now it's animated in Blender, or not. Wait, why is it not? I guess the demo effect just hit me. It was going pretty well so far, but oh, okay. Okay, now, okay. So I think the first keyframe didn't. Okay, it's just moving very slowly, but you see that this thing is slowly moving down. So it's animated, but you want to also bake the animation, and you do that by going here. There's something called non-linear animation, and when you click that, this sort of drop-down menu here appears. I don't know what it does. It's called push. You push it. You press that button that I just did, and then it's baked into the object. So then you do the exact same thing you just did before. You say export, and then the GLTF file again. And here I'll just call it hubs2 export GLTF. And then, oh, actually, never mind. Okay, I didn't. So now I don't export full scene. I just want to export that one thing I have selected, right? So here you want to make sure include just selected object, and animation is already checked, so that needs to be checked just to make sure. And then when you go back to hubs, so you import it the exact same way that, you know, you import the other geometry, you just drag and drop it. But the one thing you have to make sure, because I actually ran into that problem and it was really annoying until I figured it out. The one thing you want to make sure is that before you publish, so this is one of these objects that I animated. So here, when you select the object, it gives you the position and it gives you the URL, whatever is uploaded. But by default, loop animation is not selected. It just says none. And when you publish it, it won't do anything. And so you want to have that selected. So all of my models here, you see this one and this one, they all have that loop animation selected. So you have to do that for each piece. And then, yeah, when you publish it, then it's gonna should hopefully play. You don't see it, and there's no preview in Spoke, unfortunately, for the animation. So you kind of have to trust that it's there, and remember that you have to hit that button. So that's it. That's a trick. It's really, again, not a Blender animator. I've done a lot of 3D Max stuff, and I'm actually, one thing I'm working on right now is figuring out how to, there is a plugin for 3D Max to export GSAPP files, but somehow I haven't been able to get it to work, because that would be easier for me because I know better how to animate in 3D Max, but it seems like the default software that a lot of people are using is Blender. So I'm also not sure about the baking animation part in Max and stuff like that. So at the moment, at least this is one workflow that works. So I recommend, I'm sure there's going to be more different paths and different ways to do it, but this is one then. Cool. All right. Any more questions or thoughts? Enough for today. Okay. Thank you so much for listening and being here and being engaged. And yeah, come to the next one in 2 weeks. We're gonna get deeper into these things and talk about representation in a larger sense, and also have a really awesome guest, Leah. So yeah, I'll stop it here, but be in touch. And if you have any questions, just you all have my contact, so just hit me up. All right, have a good night.